All right, today we've got Zach from Dizzle Dynasty joining us to talk about his latest Dynasty rankings, which includes his top 450 Dynasty players ranked. And you can check that out. It's entirely free. We will bring him in here and we will discuss how you can find these rankings, what goes into them, some players that have been recent risers and fallers on his rankings, some of the guys at the top, of course, as we'll always try and discuss some of them, maybe even some players that we could see rising or falling this upcoming season. We will bring Zach in here in just a moment so that we can discuss his rankings. All right, and we have Zach here with us to discuss just Dynasty basketball in general, and we're going to reference some of his rankings, maybe look at some of the changes to his rankings recently. But before we get into talking about player specifics and our outlooks on them, Zach, how are you doing, and how have you been enjoying? I guess it's now the preseason and doing some preseason content.
Doing good, man. Thank you, and I appreciate you having me on once again. I know we've been on a couple times recently, so I appreciate it. But yeah, doing well. Looking forward to the season returning. It really can't come soon enough at this point. I feel like it's just kind of chomping at the bit at this point. I can see everybody, especially on Twitter, also feeling the same way with all of their various conversations. But yeah, it's time to come back. It's time to come back and start talking about basketball again in full swing.
Yes, the meaningless offseason conversations that you're like, how do you have time to even have this argument right now? Like, go do something else with your life. But then it happens on Twitter because
and then
it's not going to happen anywhere else.
Absolutely. Yep.
But we'll go ahead and get in and start talking about some of these guys and take a look at some of the guys that you have ranked different places. And right at the top, there's nothing. It's like right on there with the consensus. It's the same top four, same top seven. But one of the guys that we definitely I want to talk about here is Jalen Williams. And obviously the Thunder are coming off winning the NBA Finals. And if you take a look at our partners at FanDuel, they currently have the Thunder at minus odds to win 60-plus games and pretty low odds to win 65-plus. And you can even bet on them winning 70-plus games this season. And it's not that long of odds. Like if you can bet on them winning 70 games at plus 800, that's not super long odds there at all because the Thunder are going to be that good this year. They're the favorites to win the West. They're the favorites to win the NBA Finals, to go back-to-back. This team's going to be around for a while, and Jalen Williams is a big part of that. And if you believe in the Thunder and you believe in Jalen Williams, you can check out our partners at FanDuel and take a look at some of the odds they have on the Thunder because they're expecting them to be very, very good this season. But if we're taking a look at Jalen Williams from a dynasty perspective, you have him ranked 8th overall. I have him 11th. I think right around the top 10 is pretty much consensus. There might be some that have him a little bit lower down that just maybe aren't quite believers yet based on what we've seen. But what are your expectations for Jalen Williams coming off of the season that he just had?
Yeah, so I expect him just to keep on going from exactly where he started, if not go, potentially a tiny bit higher. The different counting stats. He just has a super clean stat set. He's able to get these rebounds, these assists. He's a very good defensive player. He's a good player. I mean, he's exactly kind of what your ideal player is in certain respects for Dynasty, where you have this guy who is so good in a variety of categories and can help you win, pretty frequently. I mean, he's a very consistent player. If you look at some of his statistical analysis just from Basketball Monster of the past season, I mean, on the season, he was 27th overall. Last 2 months of the season, he was 30th. He's a very consistent player. You know what you're getting with him. He's a very safe player. He's taken really good jumps over the last 3 years, especially to warrant the contract that he got. And yeah, I expect him to fully maintain his position in the top 20 year to year. I think there's always the possibility if, and I don't think it's probably going to happen for at least a while that we can reasonably predict. But, if he ever was traded, I think it's pretty fair to assume he could be a first option on, a lot of teams, and so I don't know. I just think he's a very consistent player, and I expect him just to keep maintaining this high level for quite a while to come.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, throughout his first 3 years in the NBA, he's been very consistent. It's a really good word for it. The efficiency did dip this past season as the usage went up, but we've seen it be really high for a player in his first couple of years in the NBA. And perhaps next season we can see the efficiency rise back up. So there's definitely a path for him to be even better than he was during his first 3 seasons in the NBA, which led to an NBA Finals for the Thunder. And they have this nice core to build around with SGA, Jalen Williams, and Chet, and 10 billion draft picks, plus a bunch of other young players. So, I mean, those types of decisions have to be made at some point as far as like roster changes. But I think it seems like these 3 are obviously going to be the priority. Obviously should be pretty safe for a little while, but things change. Things change all the time. And if that does happen, that only does raise Jalen Williams' ceiling. So it is potentially very, very exciting.
Yeah. And I'll say too, I think speaking to the draft picks thing, I mean, there's always potential where, OKC continues to bring in players. I mean, eventually you need to make some consolidation moves. There's always been rumors about, Lauri Markkanen. There's always been rumors about, a variety of other guys. Entirely possible that they bring somebody else in to which, everyone sees slight hits. So, yeah, I mean, totally possible at some point if, Jalen Williams continues to drop. I think for me, it's just about the consistency thing. I think that matters a lot. And I think exactly what you're getting in terms of a, 20 plus point per game scorer, somebody who can get, 5 rebounds, 5 assists, get you your defensive counting stats, not really hurt you anywhere for the most part. I really like that in a player. That's always been one of my favorite archetypes in Dynasty and especially in fantasy. I love sort of that Mikal Bridges. I love that Jalen Williams. That's just kind of my guy,
No, very fair. A guy that you've had, or I guess he rose up your ranks about 8 spots to 62 is Walker Kessler, center for the Utah Jazz. And I think after his rookie year, the expectations for him in Dynasty were very, very high. And then kind of an inconsistent role, not his fault, but just the way that Utah has been operating the past couple of years has definitely kind of changed that, because actually looking at it, Walker Kessler and Jalen Williams both had fantastic second halves of their rookie year and were thought of very, very highly after that. Now I think our expectations are probably more fair for Kessler, but what are we expecting for him this upcoming season, with the sense that Utah has said that, hey, they're done tanking, but they also traded away all their veterans. And now it's like, yeah, maybe they're not going to try and lose games on purpose, but they have all these young players. Maybe they're not going to be a very good team. Are we expecting Walker Kessler to play enough to really have this breakout season and be dominant in fantasy?
I hope so. I have good expectations for him. I do think he's a very good player. I think a lot of what's shaken up some of that is a lot of the rumors of, Utah wanting to move on from him already, which, I mean, still totally a concern, right? Like, it's entirely possible that he does get traded at some point. He doesn't end up being the guy of the future for Utah, ends up in a timeshare somewhere. All entirely possible. I totally own that. And, perhaps some of my rankings may be too high, especially in that regard. That being said, I think for me, he's another guy kind of like Jalen Williams, where it's just this level of consistency. And I think it's taken a good step up this year, this prior year, where he started to score over 10 points per game, 11.1, his first year scoring over 10, continuing with the high rebounds, jumped up to 12 after, having really high amounts, playing 23 minutes per game, his rookie season and his second season. Everything just took the jump. And yet, what kind of maintained despite, the slight increase in minutes is his blocks. He's always been a high block guy. This past season was his third, having over 2 blocks per game. That's incredibly valuable. To have someone that has this, I don't want to say outlier block skill, but certainly, in terms of the statistics, high blocks, that's extremely helpful. And so what I hope is that this past year is kind of at least slightly the norm. I do expect that, potentially with Kyle Filipowski kind of rising up the ranks, this may result in some hits in, maybe his points, maybe his rebounds, maybe kind of settles more to like that, 10, 11, 2 blocks per game, type beat. But I am very high on him. I suppose. I do think that he's a good player, and I hope that Utah does kind of see him up this guy of the future, because I think he can be. I think he's a really solid player that does a lot. And I think this year is really just going to be the test of it, just because it seems like they've been looking at trading him at some point. This year, like you mentioned, they don't really seem they want to tank. So, maybe this is the year we kind of see that this is a guy who kind of contributes more to that winning element, and that he plays, very consistently in that regard. So I guess we'll see. But I do like him in general. I do think highly of him.
Yeah, I think having him as a defensive stopper down low definitely helps them a lot because they don't have too many really high level defenders on this team at all.
Right.
And a guy like Kyle Filipowski and now Yusuf Nurkic being there shouldn't change too much. But having Walker Kessler as a rim protector, I think, is really huge. When outside of maybe Taylor Hendricks, there's not too many high level defenders on this team. And if you look at, you mentioned Kessler's block staying around just like a touch under 2.5 per game, despite the minutes increase. Sometimes we see these centers playing, 18 to 20 or 23 minutes per game, like Walker Kessler. And it's kind of like, okay, you have this freedom to go be more aggressive and block shots because there's somebody else here that's also splitting minutes with you. But then when you bump up to playing 30 plus minutes per game, it's like, okay, you're a starter now. You have to be a little bit safer about it. We can't have you getting in foul trouble. And the blocks stayed around the same. They didn't increase despite the minutes increase, but they also didn't go down, which I think is also a nice thing because he was still able to be super productive. So yeah, I don't think anything's going to change in regards to the type of stats that he's putting out. Hopefully he can stay around that 30-minute per game mark, if not higher. And I think if he does get traded elsewhere, I'm not super discouraged by that because I would like any sort of offset with maybe somebody else on that team needing minutes. Like maybe it is some sort of minute split. I would assume that a team isn't going to trade for Walker Kessler unless he is going to be their starter.
Right.
Then if he's hovering around 28 minutes per game on a better team, I actually feel pretty comfortable with that. So yeah, I'm excited to see what he can do. I think that if he was in a different situation, we probably would have already seen him have bigger seasons, and we would think of him higher in Dynasty if he hadn't been kind of on the tanking Jazz.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think, that's such an important part of analyzing Dynasty is kind of looking at, that sort of that tanking team, kind of analyzing what that means and the numbers that they put up. But then it's also, part of that is also the contract. He's coming up on year 4. I think in regards to any sort of trade, that's one of the things, like you said, that matters. If somebody's going to trade for him and they're interested in potentially paying him, that's going to be kind of the thing, is that they see him as sort of this starter material guy, to which, we're going to need to take stock of that in Dynasty, and that definitely matters.
100%. Another player that we can talk about here is Malik Monk, who you've had dropped about 12 spots. And I know there was a little bit of the Malik Monk craze during a stretch of last season where he was producing at an insane level prior to the De'Aaron Fox trade. And then De'Aaron Fox got traded, and it was like, oh, maybe even more usage for Malik Monk. But then it wasn't quite as good down the stretch. He's dropped a bit down in your rankings. I think I have him ranked a good bit lower than that even. But I've been pretty pessimistic on Malik Monk. What are we thinking for Malik Monk moving forward? How does he fit in Sacramento, or does he even fit in Sacramento?
I think that's the question. It seems like even Sacramento themselves is questioning this, which is why, even from the moment that I put out my rankings, I had to drop him a little bit because I think I was just a little bit too reactionary on it, quite honestly. And I totally own that. And I think, anyone who makes rankings, is oftentimes can be prisoner of the moment to stuff like that. Even the best of us, I think, can do that. That being said, I do still think that Malik Monk is a quality player. And, quite honestly, it's hard for me to understand some of what Sacramento is feeling. One of the most documented things over, I guess, since the De'Aaron Fox trade to now is that they are kind of looking for this franchise, quote unquote, franchise point guard. Right. And I guess their best attempt at it, to date has been bringing in Dennis Schroeder, which that is what it is. We know what kind of we're getting with Dennis Schroeder, no disrespect. But I do kind of maintain my take that I think Malik Monk is their best passer on the team. I think he's a very underrated, very good passer. He has very good vision and feel. I think, and I'm not saying for sure that he is like kind of their quote unquote franchise point guard, but I do think that he at least has the potential to get there. I really do like his assists. I think his fantasy game took a nice jump this year. I believe offhand, he did finish in the top 100 this year. I believe
he did 99th.
99th. Okay. Yeah. And I think I believe if you punt turnovers too, I think it's like he's closer to like the top 70, which is interesting. I think for me, there is potential that he could stick around there. I think we're gonna need to see Sacramento shuffle up some pieces or but I mean, like I said, it seems like they've been really wanting to trade him, especially with this Jonathan Kuminga business. I have no idea what to even make of that. So maybe, where I have him is too high, but I don't know, man. I do like him as a player, though. I do think there is potential to kind of stick around that higher range.
Yeah, I think he's a player that I tend to be lower on than consensus, or that this type of player where it's like I've seen him be productive in a high usage role, but I wouldn't, if I were in charge of a team, if I were a GM, if I were a coach, I wouldn't want him playing this super high usage role because I don't think that would lead to a ton of wins. So in the situation he's in Sacramento, I would assume that Schroeder starts with Levine, DeMar, Keegan Murray, and Domantas Sabonis. So that's Malik Monk back in a 6-man role. And maybe you would want to start him over Dennis Schroeder. But since they just signed him, I don't think that happens. And then if there is a ton of roster turnover here for Sacramento and they trade Sabonis, they trade Levine, they trade DeMar, like whatever happens, and Malik Monk sticks around, like, yeah, he could be in a high usage role on a bad team as they rebuild. And then by the time this team's ready to be competitive, he's over the age of 30. So there's definitely talent here. There's definitely the ability to produce. Mm-hmm. He's just a player that I tend to be a little lower on, I think.
Yeah, and that's totally fair. I think, and you bring up a great point with Dennis Schroeder. It is this team politics element. And that is one of the things that I try to acknowledge a lot in my rankings is, kind of thinking about these team elements, these contractual elements, the different moves that are made that kind of signal different things. I mean, Dennis Schroeder, of course, being brought in, that is kind of their guy. So, it makes total sense that they would start him. And same goes with Keon Ellis. Like, it seems like Keon Ellis is another one of their guys, same with Monk, where it's like, what's kind of the plan here? Like, you're not, you still have interest in Keon Ellis. You call him sort of this, this cornerstone piece that you want to keep. And yet, still no contract, we still don't really know what the role looks like. A lot of confusion with that last year, especially. It's just one of those things you have to kind of pay some mind to when you analyze a lot of this stuff. It's just looking at a lot of those team elements because, I mean, it really can tell you a handful of things. I mean, teams get it wrong just like we do, but it is one of those things that's just kind of important to, consider in its entirety.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's also part of the reason that I'm not a little bit lower on Monk is some of the other players that are there. Like, I'm a huge Keon Ellis fan, and I feel like I'm pretty high on Keon Ellis. So if I'm like just betting on who I think should be getting those minutes or who I think will be really productive, I would prefer Keon Ellis getting more minutes. But we'll see. Like, Sacramento may entirely disagree, and that may change. So it's kind of hard to bet on at this point.
I struggle with Sacramento. I think this year, I don't think I dropped him a considerable amount, and I'm just kind of looking here. So Sabonis, he was actually one that I increased up 2 spots this time on my ranks. I know last time he was a little bit, it seems like I've kind of been like a little like mixed on him. I do have some concerns just in general about Sacramento this year. I don't really know what to expect. And that's another thing too. I mean, there's a lot of smoke with the, Sabonis potential trade. It's hard to really know sometimes with that, man. I mean, Keon Ellis is another guy I really like a lot, but I mean, same thing, it's like, it's hard to really know what to expect in terms of the role, especially for what they've done so far. I guess I'm just generally kind of a little bit lower on Sacramento. I mean, certainly in a win total article I did a couple weeks ago, I had them taking the under on their wins. I kind of struggled to see it with them this year.
Yeah, for sure. We'll move on to talking about another player who you actually brought up in your Dynasty rankings, despite the fact that he will be missing the first probably 3-4 months of the season. We'll see exactly how much time he ends up missing. It's totally unclear. I think when he was streaming one time, this is Kyrie Irving. When he was streaming one time, he said he was going to be like some ridiculous percentage, like, he needs to be 10,000% healthy or something stupid like that. So what does that mean? I don't know. But Kyrie Irving is obviously very, very productive, despite being 33 years old. He'll be closer to 34 by the time we see him play again, coming off the knee injury. He's still a player that I value pretty highly in Dynasty. how optimistic are you about Kyrie and just how he fits in with this current Dallas team?
Yeah. So, another example of me, I think, being maybe a little bit too reactionary to certain things. On my previous ranks, I had him 87th, and I brought him up to 76th. I think at the time I did feel a little bit worried. Knowing his injury history, knowing what's to come, kind of thinking about some of the Cooper Flag and Anthony Davis stuff. I think I kind of brought him up just thinking it seems like he's still going to continue being Kyrie. I think there's always that level of concern though with him. I mean, like you said, he's already older. He is going to be turning 34 during the season. Definitely cause for concern. I think it's clear that he's going to be, this is kind of a regular thing where he's going to just keep missing time, every single year moving forward. And, he still puts up elite numbers. He's an elite scorer. He's still, he's Kyrie. Everyone loves Kyrie, but yeah, I think I felt a little bit better on him recently. I mean, especially thinking about Dallas's context right now, they still are really, and especially opening the season when he's going to be out, they're really going to lack in shot creation. That's going to be a really big thing that they need to address throughout the season. And whoever kind of picks up those duties in the meantime, I guess we'll see. But Kyrie's still going to play an important role. And so I think that's kind of why I kind of turned back on him, both hoping that his health maintains and just, considering that his role, I think, is going to be fairly safe to some extent.
Yeah, the health is definitely a big question mark and always has been for him. He's played 70 games 3 times in his career, and they were all with Cleveland. He's played 60 games twice since then, once with Boston, and then once his first year, which I think was partially in Brooklyn, partially in Dallas. Mm-hmm. Generally, he's hovering around playing in the 50s for games. So that is always a question mark, and obviously he's not going to reach that this year because he's going to miss the first few months of the year, but tends to just continue to be really, really productive when he's on the floor. In the meantime, I guess we'll see the D'Angelo Russell show. We'll see Cooper Flag getting the ball in his hands. A lot of, I guess, just kind of getting thrown into the fire and seeing how he develops, which I think will be good for him. And then when Kyrie comes back and is healthy, then things just get a little bit easier for the whole team. So I do think that, like you said, like the context of Dallas' situation, like they are going to try and win now, despite also having Cooper Flag there to provide for the future. But obviously, I think the pressure is on Nico Harrison to deliver a title because you don't trade Luka Doncic without having to win a championship, basically. So they're going to try and make this thing work with Kyrie Irving, with Anthony Davis, with the rest of this roster in the short term, and then with Cooper Flag in the long term. So I think making sure Kyrie is back healthy, and now we could take that as, depending on how the regular season is going, maybe they even delay his return. Like maybe they're actually doing better than they were expecting. So like, hey, like we're fine with you. Like let's make sure you're 100% and have extra time to rehab, and then we'll slowly ease you into things. Maybe he doesn't even play a realistic amount of minutes until March, but maybe if their season isn't going as well, do they feel more pressure to bring him back earlier, or do they kind of just throw the towel in on their season and say, hey, Kyrie, we don't want to rush you back for meaningless basketball, so we're all good. So there are a good bit of question marks for this upcoming season, but I think still in Dynasty, just the fact that there aren't too many players that can produce the way Kyrie Irving is, we still have to have him pretty high.
Yeah, no, most definitely you do. And I'll tell you too, one of the interesting observations I'd kind of made with, just sort of anticipating injury, especially with Kyrie and kind of looking at my rankings. So if you kind of look at my rankings, I have Kyrie currently at 76, and then I have Kawhi Leonard at 77. Now, what's interesting, and certainly, in terms of the injury histories and, time missed for, both of them, very different. I would say Kyrie is certainly the more healthy one of the two of them. But, what's interesting when you kind of look at startups like the one that we had, or the Dynasty mock that we had done kind of recently, kind of looking at this, Kyrie went in the 5th round, he went 5.9, but then Kawhi Leonard went 8.13. Just pretty interesting divide there. To see Kawhi kind of fall out of the top 100 like that, because of his injuries. Just an interesting observation. I wanted to kind of include that in terms of how we think about injuries and just kind of where you can kind of look for value, especially in startups this offseason.
Yeah, it is kind of weird how that works, because Kyrie has definitely kind of had the injury reputation, but I think it's been a different injury reputation than Kawhi. Then obviously there
Yeah.
was the season where Kyrie was suspended because he wasn't getting vaccinated, and then he was out. And then I think that's when Kyrie's reputation was at an all-time low,
Yeah.
just in the sense of like, hey, this guy's not going to play. But then I think he's done a good bit to improve that, and maybe that's why people tend to be a little bit more optimistic about him than with Kawhi. But maybe that is just a really good place to get good value on Kawhi Leonard.
Yeah, seems like it for sure.
All right. Next player I want to talk about is a guy that I think that I tend to be higher on than everyone else. That I think you drop a good bit down in your rankings. That's Devin Vassell in San Antonio. And I think for me, I'm still just betting on him as a player and as a talent right now. And I know the situation isn't necessarily ideal in the sense that they've added Stephon Castle. Now they've added Dylan Harper, and Harper doesn't directly impact Vassell, but there's just a lot of this, I guess, this influx of young talent on this roster that's now looking to eventually take over and get minutes. So I think I'm less optimistic that Devin Vassell is going to be the number 2 or number 3 scoring option in San Antonio moving forward or in the future. But I still think that he can be that level of scorer, maybe on a different team, and can provide a ton of threes, some defensive stats. I think he's an underrated passer. He's a really high level shot creator. So I think he's just, I don't know, maybe it doesn't happen until he's on a different team, but he is in my mind, he's a very high level player. And if he sticks around in San Antonio and they don't move him, I do think he's a starter. I would not bring him off the bench, but we'll see if San Antonio agrees as Castle develops. But I think having him as a floor spacer with De'Aaron Fox having the ball in his hands right now, or Dylan Harper in the future, and having obviously Victor Wembanyama on the floor, it all impacts things a lot and opens. And having Vassell there opens a lot up for them. So I tend to be higher on him than I think most people are. But what's your outlook on Vassell?
Yeah, so it's tough. I mean, it definitely is tough. He didn't have as great of a year as he did last year for sure. I think, there's certainly a variety of factors for that. And yeah, I do think that he has good potential to bounce back. He, as I kind of look at Basketball Monster, he was pretty good, in the last couple months of the season, which is encouraging. Hopefully he can, continue to make progress. I think for me, that was kind of the concern was just, with Stephon Castle, with, Dylan Harper coming in, with De'Aaron Fox already there. There is definitely some level of concern about how that sort of, balances out, especially with, and, who we'll see about Carter Bryant, but, definitely some, incoming players to kind of watch for and just see how that shakes out. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned just the potential of him getting traded because, yeah, I think that's one of the things that would definitely make me see an increase, if not just kind of the game improving this year. Any sort of trade is really going to help him a lot. He's going to be a solid player for another team. And, kind of speaking to, certain traits that happened in the offseason, he would have been a great one if he went to Phoenix for Kevin Durant. I think he would have been a very good player there. But yeah, I think a lot of people kind of turned a little bit on Devin Vassell. I know he was kind of a fantasy and stat head fan favorite for a little bit. Seems like he kind of fell a little bit out of favor with people kind of thinking he may have been overrated. I certainly don't think he's overrated. I think he's fairly rated for what it's worth. But yeah, I like Devin Vassell still. I did drop him for sure, but I am still optimistic about him coming around.
Yeah, and we'll see. It's a lot of it will be situational. We'll see how the season goes. His field goal percentage took a hit this past season. We'll see if maybe it can improve this year with De'Aaron Fox there and playing more because obviously they didn't get a ton of time. I think I was doing an episode with Matt Lawson. It was 120 total minutes that De'Aaron Fox and Wemby played together. So that's not a lot of time for that duo. That's not a lot of time for the rest of the team to be playing with them. So maybe having the whole offseason and then preseason, training camp, all this stuff to kind of figure out how to play together just makes things a little bit better for everyone. So I think that's kind of my optimistic outlook on it. But then maybe my more realistic one is maybe that still doesn't matter and Devin Vassell still ends up being traded. But I don't think there's too many players in this team that should feel super safe long term in the sense that anyone should and can get traded to make this team more competitive to bring championships around Victor Wembanyama. I think he's probably the only player that you would say is 100% never going to get traded because they're trying to win championships with him as the star.
Yeah, no, most definitely. I think he's definitely the only safe one. And, you know, kind of thinking about, you know, again, kind of coming back to what I said earlier about considering, you know, contracts and considering the money outlook of things. You know, one of the things about the about the De'Aaron Fox contract is that it seems like it kind of lines up perfectly with whenever, you know, Wemby kind of gets that huge money and they kind of, you know, kind of accounting for the jump in the salary cap, you know, when it kind of gets to that point. But then also just kind of Wemby's money, you know, all their other young players' money. It seems like it just kind of lines up perfectly with that to look at a potential trade if they feel it needs to be made. So that's one of the things definitely to consider, you know, as you kind of project things outward for, you know, the Spurs, for Fox, for Wemby, just one of those things to think about for the team at large. Now, one of my other questions I did want to ask you about San Antonio, you know, with Devin Vassell, with the addition of Harper, with, you know, Castle, you know, being the rookie of the year, how do you kind of see their starting lineup shake out?
I would say Fox and Wemby are locked in. I
Yep.
would start Vassell as well.
Mhm.
Probably ends up being Castle at the 2 with Harrison Barnes at the 4. I think just having a veteran presence in there. Now,
Yeah.
obviously, you know, if I'm playing 2K or if like we're fantasy managers and want to do it, we're not starting Harrison Barnes. Because we're not super excited about that.
Right.
But he seems to kind of be a fixture of the starting lineup, a nice veteran presence, doesn't need the ball a ton, just a solid player. So I think that makes sense. That's probably the way that I think it shakes out, at least to start this upcoming season.
Yeah.
But they obviously have a number of other talented players that'll fight for it. I think Jeremy Sohan will have a chance to compete for a starting spot over Harrison Barnes.
Mhm.
But the rest of those, I feel pretty confident in that's how it's going to look.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I was I was just thinking Julian Champagny, he's always inevitable. He'll start more games than he probably should. And again, no disrespect. I love Julian Champagny. I was very high on him pre-draft before he came in, but he starts a lot of games. Like he started 59 games, 23-24, and then 24-25 he started 29. So just a little tidbit for people kind of looking for some deeper value. Champagny is always there, and like I said, he is inevitable.
They love doing this thing or they did, I guess, multiple times. Maybe they won't do it anymore. Hopefully they don't. But where Devin Vassell misses a handful of games and then they bring him back in. They're like, yeah, no, we're actually going to come off the bench for 2 months and we're going to start
Yeah.
Julian Champagny. And it's like, okay, I get it for a game or two, but like, why is Devin Vassell still coming off the bench? He's healthy now. He's good. We can put him back in the starting lineup. But they're like, no, Julian Champagny. And it gets really annoying. Or if you were able to stream Julian Champagny in, then it's great. And it works out really well.
I've always said you should be putting your $27 million guy on the bench for Julian Champagny.
Yes, yes, 100%. That's what you should do.
Many are saying this.
Yes. uh, the next player we can talk about is in Indiana, and our partners at FanDuel currently have the Pacers at plus odds to make the playoffs this upcoming season. And if that's going to happen, they're going to have to figure out the center position. And Jay Huff may or may not be the solution. It could be Isaiah Jackson. But Jay Huff was a riser in your recent Dynasty rankings. Are you expecting Jay Huff to be the starter here in Indiana, or at least to play the majority of the center minutes?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to really predict a starter at this point. I mean, it could easily be Siakam, who is quote unquote the starter and doesn't play all the minutes. It could be Isaiah Jackson. I mean, certainly with the money that they seem to pay him, knowing that he had torn his Achilles, you know, the previous season, you know, maybe there is some level of belief. I think for me, the most ideal option and probably someone who will play a bulk of the minutes, if not starting a bulk of the time, is probably Jay Huff. No, I don't love Jay Huff as far as being a starter, but he's got the fantasy game for sure. He's definitely got the fantasy game that's going to appeal to us. You know, when he gets the minutes, he has looked solid, especially in Memphis. He's been one of those guys who, you know, just continues to have, you know, some level of excitability. He can do a lot for fantasy. It's entirely possible he could finish fairly high, you know, in you know rankings this year if he does play a lot. So yeah, I think he's probably their best option. I have some skepticism about Isaiah Jackson. I always kind of have, for what it's worth, but I think especially for a guy whose game is built on athleticism, coming off an Achilles tear, now, I mean, Achilles, I mean, people have recovered from Achilles for sure, but it does kind of worry me for the player that Isaiah Jackson is. So, yeah, I definitely think that Jay Huff is going to play a decent bit this year, regardless of it. And I'm interested to see the fantasy game. It, like I said, he's always looked sharp when he's got the minutes, especially when he was in Memphis. I'm just curious to see what that looks like in full-fledged, the season with Indiana.
Yeah, I think my long-term evaluation of him doesn't change too much because I don't think that he's the long-term solution in Indiana at center, but definitely a single season boost is huge and can definitely help. I mean, that is enough to bump him up dynasty rankings because I don't know exactly. I think I have him inside my top 300, like two something, but I probably had him outside of it, my previous rankings. But it's like just a single season of being a starter, all of a sudden, that's more valuable than a bunch of different dart throws that may or may not crack a rotation for a consistent amount of time. So I'm definitely happy to bump J Huff up the rankings, but the biggest impact is going to be in redraft leagues where I think he is a draftable player in standard size leagues, which is a huge step up. And then in dynasty leagues, if you're contending, then J Huff is definitely a really important player to have, and he holds a lot more value. So if you're rebuilding and you have J Huff on your roster, probably not a bad idea to trade him to a contender and see what type of value you can get.
Yeah, no, most definitely. And it's not a one-to-one comparison by any means, but one of the names I do kind of circle back when I look at J Huff is Gershon Yabusele. As we had seen this past season, when he joined up with Philly, he took up a pretty sizable role. And, that was in part to, injuries, in part to just a lot of needs they had it, especially at the four. That was just kind of a increasing problem. But, I think it's entirely possible that Jay Huff could have a season like that, kind of like Yabu, where, he takes up this role, he does a lot. He's kind of this guy who rises up. For me, for Yabu, I can't remember where I had him at the very beginning of last season. Certainly, fairly low as a flyer, but, he jumped up all the way into my top, like 180, 190, I think is where he is right now. So it just goes to show, I mean, it doesn't take a whole lot for someone to take up a sizable role and kind of go from this guy who's just fighting for a roster spot to being a key piece, a key rotation player, even for kind of more shallower leagues. So, I guess we'll see. He's certainly somebody who I think could take a pretty nice leap. So I guess we'll see.
Yeah, for sure. And now we'll move on to got a couple more teams to talk about with a couple guys that are pretty interesting. First up in Washington, both Bilal Coulibaly and Keyshawn George are very interesting players for dynasty leagues. Both have, I think, a good bit of upside. Keyshawn George is a guy that I was a little bit lower on entering the draft, and then he just really impressed me during his rookie year. And then Coulibaly, I think maybe everyone's expectations were a little bit higher for this past season, or expecting some sort of breakout. And it didn't really go the way we were necessarily expecting it to. But I still feel very confident that both of them are going to be very good players in the future, and that Washington has a nice thing cooking here, and that they're eventually going to be a very good team if they're able to have this work out. But this is kind of the really fun phase of a rebuild where you have still more picks, but you also have all these young players in the team. And right now, they're all going to turn out to be the best versions of themselves in your mind. And that's what's always super fun. It's like, oh, yeah, cool. We have multiple all defensive players. We have a couple all NBA players. We have all just on your roster. Because, of course, that's how it works. That's everybody always develops to their fullest potential. But still, the upside of these guys is really exciting. And I get why Washington fans would be excited. How are you feeling about, I guess, the whole young core, but really Coulibaly and Keyshawn George specifically?
Yeah, so I think most of the people who follow me on Twitter will definitely know that I'm a big Coulibaly fan for sure. I've been a very big advocate for him very early on. I heavily bought into his upside, especially during the draft, and his kind of rise from someone who's kind of like a projected like late into top half of the lottery. He took a really big jump. I have kind of tapered a little bit on him, but I still remain in on him, hopefully unlocking some of that upside. And it's been a ton of upside, to be clear. I mean, he seems like one of those guys, kind of like I mentioned with Jalen Williams earlier. It's this guy, this, big wing who can do a lot. He's got a really solid playmaking touch. I mean, you see the assist for his position. That's super valuable. His defensive stats, again, super, super valuable, something you most definitely want for fantasy when he comes around. For this season, despite the increases in, his points and kind of, across the board, the percentages were just not great. There was a couple negative areas. His field goal percentage was not all that impressive. His 3-point percentage, I expected him to take more threes this year and just kind of improve from three on the whole. It seemed like he almost kind of regressed a tiny bit, especially in the counting stats. And that is, certainly a little bit concerning. So I think he's somebody I kind of just had a little bit out of my top 100 for that reason. He's just, I need to see the threes improve. I really like to see him just take more in general. I believe this past season he was taking, I think 3.8 attempts. I think seeing it increase would be nice, and especially just hitting them more with consistency. The same thing with Keyshawn George, right? Like, I think I would really like to just see more threes in general from both of those guys. I'll also say too, I expected more of a jump when Kyle Kuzma left, and it never fully came. And, even in spite of Jordan Poole leaving, that kind of creates more long-term opportunity. I do think that Trey Johnson being there is probably going to make him the primary scoring option for at least the time being, not counting like someone like CJ McCollum. I think having someone who kind of takes up more of that usage, playing on the ball, scoring a lot, I think that is definitely something that makes me wonder about Koulibaly. So I have a handful of concerns. I think he can definitely get there. Like, I do anticipate that the percentages improve. I do anticipate that the threes is going to be the primary point of emphasis this offseason, as he continues just working into his body. I mean, he's a big, lanky dude. I mean, that's going to take some time. We knew he was kind of a very raw product coming in. And so I have confidence he can get there for sure. I think for me, I kind of have some questions that I just need answered this year. I think this year is going to be a really pivotal year for him, especially knowing that they're going to be, bringing in Trey Johnson, like I said, someone who's going to be kind of potentially that, lead scoring option, second scoring option, kind of seeing where guys shake out. And then just kind of looking into the future where, they have this chance of getting a top 3 pick in this draft. And that's going to be insanely valuable, getting one of DeBonsa, Boozer, or Darren Peterson. I mean, that's going to be immediately probably their best, I would say probably their best player, in this rebuild to date.
Yeah.
And that certainly matters to bring in more of those pieces, with Sarr, with Trey Johnson, with one of those guys, where does that kind of leave Koulibaly? So just kind of answering some questions this year is really where I'm at. I think I could easily see him jumping back into my top 100. I mean, I love the guy. I think he'll certainly make the jump back in. He's a very fun basketball player. But yeah, just some handful of questions I need answered this year.
It is kind of crazy that you bring up a good point to think about the fact that, okay, some of these bad teams, like Washington, like Utah, that are going to be at the bottom of the standings, that have a number of really talented, exciting upside players, that everything could kind of go out the window if the draft lottery actually goes their way this upcoming season, because it doesn't tend to for these bad teams, or it hasn't recently. It's just been some average, barely in the lottery team that's been able to leap up and get the coveted prospect the last 2 years, even though there wasn't too many coveted prospects in 2024. But the fact, especially this past year, that it was Dallas and San Antonio making the top 2 picks, and then Philly. So what if it does go differently this upcoming season, and the teams at the bottom actually end up with some of the top picks? And then it's like, okay, like, yeah, you have Koulibaly. Oh shoot, you added Trey Johnson. Well, you also have Keyshawn George. Well, you also have Bub Carrington, but now we have Darren Peterson too. Okay, how does this all work? And like, who matters? And right. I think guys like Koulibaly and George, I feel a little bit more confident in than maybe above Carrington, in the sense that, yeah, if they get Darren Peterson, or if they get DeBonsa, or they get Cam Boozer, then that's probably going to be their number one scoring option. And Bub Carrington's a score first guard. Whereas Koulibaly, like, maybe he doesn't quite reach his potential, and we do bump him down our rankings a little bit, but maybe he just focuses a little bit more on defense, or he gets easier looks on offense. So he tempers our expectations for his production. Same thing with Keyshawn George, who's a high-level defender and does a number of things well on offense, and is a better shooter than what I think he showed as a rookie. where they can fit in on this new team, but maybe don't have that same level of upside that they would with the way the roster is currently constructed.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, he's a great defender. He really is. And I think, when you kind of look at when you evaluate Dynasty and you kind of, look past sort of these guys who have good stats, when you kind of take away the stat stuff, one of the things I do try to look for is these guys who have these high-end skills. And that's one of the things that Koulibaly definitely offers that I think will, at the very minimum, make him a role player in the NBA, is that he is such a good defender. Certainly with Washington's numbers at the moment, it's not ideal. A lot of the advanced stats aren't going to paint him in the best light for his defense, but he's a really good defender for sure. And I think that's just one of the things that's going to keep him around for a bit. And, even if I had kind of dropped him out of my top 100, I have no trouble seeing him kind of stick for the next 5 or more years in sort of that like top 100, top 150 range. I think there's certainly a possibility. I think at this point, I'm not so certain on, potentially reaching like fringe all-star levels, anything like that. But can he be Jaden McDaniels? Yeah, I think he probably could. I think it's certainly possible. So, just one of those things to consider. He is just such a good defender. And I struggle to see him dropping like significantly far from where I'm at now, unless something crazy happens.
For sure. And one more team we can talk about with a little bit differently from Washington, where we're going to talk about where we did talk about 2 of their young prospects and upside guys. We'll talk about one of those, and then a guy that isn't exactly young with upside, a little bit of an older player that we still have questions about. We're going to talk about in Detroit, Ron Holland, and then Malik Beasley, with Holland being a guy that rose up your rankings a good bit. And I'm expecting to have an improved second season that I think is a really talented player that is going to be important long-term for Detroit. Him and Asar Thompson have the potential to be an incredibly annoying defensive duo for other teams, I guess. For 2019, for Detroit, it's going to be great. But for 2019, it's going to be very annoying to have to play against them consistently, especially if they can figure out any semblance of a jump shot. Then this team's going to be very, very dangerous. How are you viewing Ron Holland moving forward?
I've always really liked Ron Holland. I was very high on him pre-draft. I wish I had my board from 2024 pulled up at the moment. I can pull that up in a moment and look. But gosh, I really like Ron Holland, and I don't want to put a ton of stock into summer league for understandable reasons, but I mean, dude, he was one of the best players I had seen at summer league. I think by a pretty good margin. He was really sharp. He just looked so dominant, looked ready to play. All around, just really impactful player. I'm really excited about him this year. And I think, kind of the shuffling of, like we mentioned, Malik Beasley, kind of figuring out how some of that looks. I think Asar Thompson and Ron Holland are both in for really solid seasons. I really, really like what I've seen from both.
Yeah, and then for Beasley, how do we view him as a dynasty asset at all? Because it seems like he may or may not be back with the team. There's a chance that he's banned from the NBA, but Detroit's leaving a roster spot open. So if he is back, does anything change from his role from last season? I mean, Tim Hardaway Jr. is gone, but they drafted Chaz Lanier, in my mind, who was supposed to kind of replace that perimeter shooting that they would have lost from both Hardaway and Malik Beasley being gone. But maybe Beasley's back and coming off nearly leading the league in 3-pointers made. So how do we view Malik Beasley in Dynasty?
The short answer is that, kind of facing what he's facing right now. And, I think he's certainly in a better place right now than Terry Rozier was, last season when he was also getting investigated. But, unfortunately, when it comes to an asset like Malik Beasley, he is closer to being worth very little to nothing right now than he is to being worth a good bit like he was previously. And, for me, kind of before all these allegations, he was about like a top like 200 player, kind of in that range. And that's a good player. I mean, that's somebody who is, worth a decent amount, when you're playing in kind of a deeper league. But it's just hard to really evaluate right now. I mean, if you're holding him, you're kind of just hoping that things turn out okay and he's not he's cleared of any wrongdoing. I think just leaving the open roster spot at least gives me some hope that he can return and that things are going to hopefully be okay. I guess we'll see how that turns out. But I'm at least hopeful that he can stick around. I do think that, regardless of whatever happens, there's a chance he could see kind of a drop, with Ron Holland improving, with the Sar Thompson coming in, with, I guess, what I would almost interpret it as kind of recreating him in the aggregate by adding Duncan Robinson, adding Karis LeVert, the return of Jaden Ivey, having Chaz Lanier kind of at the ready as they, he kind of, proves what he can. I would anticipate he probably plays very little minutes and maybe plays in the G League for a little bit, just kind of depending on what happens. But yeah, it's tough. It's tough on Malik Beasley for sure. I mean, you are just kind of waiting for that verdict to see what happens. I mean, it's always scary whenever someone gets investigated for that reason. You just hope everything turns out okay. But it's kind of weird to view him. So that's kind of how I'm looking at it now, is just being careful, just watching out. And then also acknowledging if he does return, he may not be what he was this past season, just because, like I said, they have a handful of these guys they brought in for, like I said, what I assume is probably just recreating him in some aggregate.
For sure. That's going to do it for this episode. Zach, before I let you go, one, thank you so much for hopping on and talking about a handful of players, talking about your rankings. But where can we find your work and what do you have coming up that we can be on the lookout for?
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's wonderful to be here. I appreciate you having me on again. As for that, you can find me pretty much anywhere at Dizzle Dynasty. I mentioned last time when we were on for your pre-draft show, we've been working on some video content, and that continues to be something we're working on. We've been writing a lot of articles recently. We plan to have, more Dynasty releases coming up soon, more rankings updates every single month until we get up to the season. A lot more coming for sure. Look forward to that. Well, we have a lot of exciting video content we're especially excited to share as we get closer to the season. So yeah, stay tuned for that. Dizzle Dynasty on YouTube, on Twitter, all that good stuff.
Definitely excited to see what Zach, Brian, and Jay have coming up. Give them a follow at Dizzle Dynasty, and then you can check out some of the other accounts they have within there. And then you can also find Zach's Dynasty rankings, top 450 players, top 75 rookies, all right there pinned on his Twitter. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Young Man Squad Fantasy Basketball Podcast, which is part of the Old Man Squad Sports Network, part of Believe Network, and brought to you by FanDuel. We'll see you next time.